Hello everybody, my name is Emmanuel Lozerand. I teach modern Japanese language and literature. I came to Inalco as a first-year student to beginning Japanese in September 1983, almost 40 years ago. And I've been teaching here since 1993. I'm on my way to joining the ranks of the oldest instructors here, and that's probably why my colleagues wanted me to tell you about the history of the school this morning. And since I'm probably the worst English speaker in the school, they asked me to deliver this talk in English. I apologize in advance for torturing you. Our school has its roots in the French Revolution. It was instituted by decree of the convention that was adopted on 10 Germinal Year 3, or March 30th, 1795. This was a few months after the end of the Reign of Terror, during the period sometimes called the Thermidorian Convention, at the height of an economic and financial crisis. Paris was going through a severe food shortage at the end of an especially harsh winter. A foreign coalition was massing at the borders, and the value of the assignat was in free fall. Why did the National Assembly decide amid such turmoil to create a special school for Oriental languages? What urgent need was there? The original idea of our institution came from Louis Mathieu Langlais, who was the first person to sense, or at least to express, the need to create a school dedicating to teaching living Oriental languages. Langlais wasn't a great erudite, and apparently his scientific contributions were disputed in his time. But he was admirable in many ways, and he played a decisive role in making our school what it is today. I don't know Jean-François, I don't think Jean-François Inalco has given him his due. He was born in 1763 in Picardy, north of Paris, into a well-off family. He was destined for a military career. However, he was passionate about Oriental languages, and he studied Persian. His English was also very good, so he could read the numerous works on Indian history and literature that were produced and available in England in this time. He also edited Father Amiot's Manchu French Dictionary. This work involved breaking down the intimidating syllabary of Manchu into a smaller number of discrete units, an alphabet that has only 29 symbols. That brought him some renown, but it was also criticized. He did end up joining the army. He was an officer responsible for preventing and putting down duels between nobles. Still, as Dacier said, yes, the Dacier which Champollion wrote his famous letter to, Langlais continued to dedicate himself to the regions of the Oriental Muses, the Muses Orientales, and to disseminate knowledge about Asia. The events of 1789 convinced Langlais that the time had come to create a new school, and in 1790 he wrote a speech to the new National Assembly titled "On the Importance of Oriental Languages for Expanding Trade and Advancing the Humanities and Sciences." Langlais opened with the observation that the study of Oriental languages is too neglected in France. In a footnote, he explains the main causes of our unfair scorn for such an important area of study. 1, the frivolity of our old character, which is incapable of concentrated, sustained focus with the French. The government's indifference toward truly useful subjects. 3, the sarcasm of our beaux esprits, who found it easier to banter with learned men than to emulate them. And 4, finally, the insulting indulgence of the newspaper editors who preferred to quickly offer banal praise to an author rather than analyze his learned work deeply. He states that a new institution needs to, on the one hand, serve to expand our knowledge and enhance our learning, and on the other hand, to increase our wealth while facilitating our trade with one of the most beautiful parts of the world. He goes on to give a quick overview of all the texts written in Oriental languages and concludes that we owe debt to these peoples for our main concepts in sciences, philosophy, and the fundamental part of our religious system. He then explains that while we the French people, deign to learn a bit of Latin or Greek, the Danish, the Swedes, Germans, Dutch, Italians, he said even the Spanish, and especially the English, are studying the ancient and modern languages of Asia with incredible enthusiasm. He pays homage, for example, to Warren Hastings, the Governor General of India, who, he says, contributed enormously to the advancement of the Oriental languages in English institutions. He highlights the reason, which in truth is even more powerful than love for the humanities, that drives them to this study. It benefits trade immensely. This is why Langlais chose to stress how useful the Oriental languages would be for the prosperity of the state. To trade advantageously in Asia and win the trust of the native people, he asserts, you need to master their language. Langlais goes on to analyze the status of the teaching of Oriental languages in France, and in the process harshly criticizes two existing institutions. One is the Collège de France, at the time the Collège Royal, and the other is the École des Jeunes de Langue. The Collège de France, which at the time was called the Collège Royal, was created by François Ier, Francis I, in 1530. Hebrew was immediately put in the curriculum, and in 1538, the famous Guillaume Postel became an instructor of Oriental languages, in French, lecteur de langue orientale. We need to note that despite its prestige, in the 17th and 18th centuries, the college went through a period of erasure, and the revolutionaries heatedly debated its role and missions. Langlais' verdict on it was conclusive. The Collège de France, the Collège Royal, the only institution where Arabic, Turkish, and Persian are taught publicly, is an ostentatious institution more fit to flatter the vanity of the king than to enlighten studious men. The lessons are too rare and brief to allow the instructors to share their knowledge and the students to benefit from it. As for the École des Jeunes de Langue, the school of children of languages, this is a strange word, it was founded in 1669 under Louis XIV as the initiative of Colbert, who was responding to a request from the Free Port of Marseille to train future interpreters in languages of the Levant, and in particular Turkish, Arabic, Persian, and Armenian. As you know, back then the interpreters were called dragomans, from the Arabic turjuman, which also provides the French word truchement, which means through. This school has a complex history, which I won't discuss in detail here. In 1700, it was joined to the Collège de Clermont, which later became Lycée Louis le Grand. The students, who were known as jeunes de langue, young people of languages, studied partly in Constantinople, partly in Paris. Many of them were the sons of French diplomats or merchants who had long been established in the Ottoman Empire. Sometimes they were local Christians who were called Armenians, even though they actually came from diverse backgrounds. The dragomans often built family dynasties. The École des Jeunes de Langue experienced a golden age between 1721 and 1762, but then it fell apart after the Jesuit prohibition. Still, notable people studied there, including Pierre Ruffin, the first Turkish professor at the Collège de France. Once again, Langlais offered a blunt criticism. He called the Enfants de Langue an institution that was too poorly designed to escape the investigations of our vice deputies. He took aim at the central educational principle. How reckless it is to assign a child who has barely left the cradle to a life of grueling studies and a very difficult profession, both of which require special calling. Of the 10 students of the school, 2 or 3 at most will succeed. To counterbalance, what if you as obviously inadequate institution, Langlais suggested creating Arabic, Turkish, and Persian chairs in Paris and Marseille that would be given only to learned men who were naturalized among the Easterners through a long stay in Asia. These institutions could also hire retired former dragomans. The instructors could teach 4 or 5 hour-long public lessons every morning. These chairs could be funded with revenue meant from the education of the enfant de langue, which he implicitly suggested be eliminated. However, Langlais' strong arguments weren't enough. It just wasn't the right time, and the plan to create a special school was tabled. Even after he became the curator of Oriental manuscripts at the Bibliothèque Royale, Langlais did not give up. And several years later, he managed to convince Canal that his idea had merit. Joseph Canal was a major player in the French Revolution, who is under-recognized now in France. Hailing from the department of Ariège, in southwest of France, this former Catholic priest was elected deputy to the convention, where he sat among the montagnards. As a member and then chair of the Public Education Committee, he played a key role in overhauling the French education system. He reformed the military schools, helped create many primary schools, established the École Normale de l'An 3, originally the École Normale Supérieure de la Rue d'Ulm, and École Centrale des Travaux Publics, which was soon renamed as École Polytechnique, and also the Conservatoire National des Arts et Métiers. After he was approached by Langlais, he delivered a speech to the convention on behalf of the Public Education Committee and Finance Committee. This speech, the report on Oriental, commercial, and diplomatic languages, led to the establishment on March 30, 1795, of the École Spéciale des Langues Orientales, or Special School for Oriental Languages, which was the forerunner of today's Inalco. This is how Canal began this speech to the convention. Among the most enlightened people of Europe, the Oriental languages occupy a distinguished position in all the institutions dedicating to spreading the Enlightenment. These languages, which have been neglected in France since the beginning of this century, the beginning of the 18th century, were almost completely abandoned during the Revolution. He requested that the languages be given a place in public education because he says the French nation must not be a foreigner in any country of any century. Unlike Langlais, who stressed trade, Canal underscored the importance of studying these languages for diplomacy. If we neglect the Oriental languages that serve as a voice of diplomacy, doesn't that amount to ceding the career of the consulates to men who are incapable of helpfully speaking up for the interest of the Republic? Would that not amount to rashly severing all communication with other nations and destroying all its foreign relations? Canal also stressed the overall academic dimension. At the same time, learned men and artists will draw from different Oriental works on astronomy, chemistry, medicine, and precious materials for the arts and sciences. He concluded pragmatically that it is necessary to enlighten the foreign nations on the defamation spread profusely against us by the Germans and English, because the pamphlets vomited by the presses of Batavia and Calcutta harmed the French Revolution in these distant regions more than the artillery of all the powers that joins forces to subjugate us. Canal then went on to review the most useful languages to teach, and especially the ones most suitable to our current situation. He separated the living languages from the scholarly or dead Oriental languages, and concluded that studying dead languages is not compatible with the unrest that inevitably accompanies major revolutions. But rather than dismissing these languages as a matter of principle, he simply postponed teaching them to a future time once the country would found a stable peace. However, he said he was urgent to teach living Oriental languages because without them it was impossible to do business profitably with the native people of Asia. He went through these languages, assessing them on a sole criterion of public and commercial utility. He immediately dismissed Chinese, which presents insurmountable challenges, and suggested that instead, one day, the school could teach Manchu Tatar if we resume relations with China. Remember that the Qing, who were Manchu, established a new dynasty in 1644 and set up a policy of strictly limiting contact with the outside world. He also dismissed Japanese, what he called the sword of Chinese dialect, that consequently presents major difficulties, and Tibetan, which in any case can be of no use in our political relations. However, he defended the usefulness of studying Malay, a language that is used on all the islands of the Indian Ocean, Persian, which is necessary in relations with the nabobs, Arabic, which is widespread in all the Muslim states, almost all of South Asia, in a large part of Africa and in Barbary, Turkish, which offers few results for literature, but, he added, our relation with the Ottoman Gate don't allow us the luxury to failing to study it. Finally, he explained that this new school needed to be housed inside the National Library, so that instructors and students could be near the manuscripts and writing works in Oriental languages. Assistance that is needed for the success of their work, but is excessively rare and expensive. If we summarize Langlet's and Lacanal's arguments, we can see three reasons justifying the creation of a new school. First, the Oriental languages are essentials for us understanding the history of humanity, and studying them automatically falls within the scope of the Enlightenment. Two, the Oriental languages are useful on a practical level for trade and diplomacy. Three, in this area, France is far behind its neighbors because the existing institutions are not up to meeting the challenges. We also need to remember that in the wake of the revolution, most of the dragomans attached to the diplomatic and consular posts of the Mediterranean region had left their position. At the same time, almost all the students of the École des Jeunes de Langue had been withdrawn from Collège Louis-le-Grand, which became the Collège of Égalité. Generally speaking, there was such a shortage of interpreters that it was impossible to find qualified candidates for open jobs. Following this report, the convention decreed, Article 1, there shall be established in the building of the National Library, not here, a public educational institution dedicated to teaching living Oriental languages, which are known to be useful for politics and trade. Two, the School of Oriental Languages shall comprise 1. An instructor of literary and spoken Arabic. 2. An instructor of Turkish and Crimean Tatar. 3. An instructor of Persian and Malay. Article 3, the instructors shall teach their students about the political and commercial relationships between the French Republic and the nations that speak the languages they will be responsible for teaching. And 4, said instructors shall write in French the grammar primus for the language they will teach, and these works will be submitted to the Public Education Committee. Pierre Bénézet, the Minister of the Interior of the Directory, was responsible for transforming this decree by the Convention into an act, and for bringing to life this monument meant for the public teaching of Oriental languages, whose outlines Lacanal's report had sketched. Classes began on June 22nd, 1796. There are 3 teachers, Langlais himself, teaching Persian and serving as the school's first director. Antoine Isaac Sylvestre de Sacy was to teach Arabic, and Jean-Michel de Venture de Paradis, Napoleon's head interpreter during the Egyptian campaign, was to teach Turkish. Also, the school gave officially priority to living languages when it was created. In principle, as we saw in the analysis by Langlais and Canal, it did not rule out the study of dead languages. It just postponed this study until more peaceful times set in. An underlying trend had been running through the European consciousness since the mid-18th century, what is called the Oriental Renaissance, as Raymond Schwab aptly named it. This Oriental Renaissance was characterized by the deciphering or better comprehension of the world's languages, and in particular, those that provide access to the major Asian texts. This movement further asserted itself in the early 19th century. To name just a few highlights, the Frenchman Abraham Hyacinthe Anctil Duperron, who left for India in 1755 at the age of 24, published his translation of the Zend Avesta in 1771. The Englishman Sir William Jones founded the Asiatic Society in Calcutta in 1784. In 1799, Wilhelm von Humboldt went to the Basque country in southwest of France to begin studies that would culminate in his well-known essays über die Kawi-Sprache auf der Insel Java, on the Kawi language of the island of Java, and his 1836 work über die Verschiedenheit des menschlichen Sprachbaus und ihren Einfluss auf die geistige Entwicklung des Menschengeschlechts, or in English, on language, on the diversity of human language construction and its influence of the mental development of the human species. In 1771, the German Carsten Niebuhr brought back copies of cuneiform inscriptions from his trip to Mesopotamia and Persia. In 1785, one Babylonian kuduru was found by the French botanist André Michaud near Baghdad, the famous Caillou Michaud. The first components to decipher the writing were put forward in 1802 by the philologist Georg Friedrich Grotefend. In June 1802, Friedrich Schlegel, the co-founder of the Jena Circle, arrived in Paris to study Persian and Sanskrit. He published Über die Sprache und Weisheit der Indier, on the language and wisdom of the Indians, in 1808. In 1811, the French prodigy Jean-Pierre Abel Rémusat published his Essai sur la langue et la littérature chinoise, essay on Chinese language and literature, and gave new life to Chinese studies which had fallen by the wayside. He was appointed an instructor at the Collège de France in 1814 when he was 26 years old. From 1821 to 1831, he and Wilhelm von Humboldt engaged in an impressive grammatical and philosophical correspondence on the Chinese language. In 1816, Franz Bopp published his thesis of the conjugation system of Sanskrit. In 1822, Champollion wrote his letter to Bon Joseph Dacier on the alphabet of phonetic hieroglyphs. And the French Société Asiatique de Paris was founded during a period of enthusiasm inspired by the successes of academic Orientalism. In 1826, the French Eugène Burnouf published his Essai sur le Pali. Paris was at the center of this tremendous European intellectual movement, where the new École des langues orientales played a leading role, as seen in the letter by a German Orientalist, Konrad Dietrich Hassler, dated March 24th, 1828. Hassler writes, the French government is doing and can do more than all the other states for Oriental scholarship. In Paris, there are two separate institutions where the majority of the language of Asia are taught for free. All these instructors, those of the École des Langues Orientales and those of the Collège de France, have educated a considerable number of students who do their teachers proud. For Hassler and for his fellow Germans, Paris was the new Mecca of Oriental knowledge. There were also the brilliant Helmina Von Klenker, who settled in Versailles at the home of Madame de Genlis in 1801. In summer 1804, she moved to Montmartre with the Schlegel brothers and other German people. In 1806, she married the Orientalist Antoine Léonard de Chézy, who in 1814 was appointed the very first chair of Sanskrit languages and literatures in Europe at the Collège de France. She dedicated an entire section of her Leben und Kunst in Paris seit Napoleon I, Life and the Art in Paris since Napoleon I, to the nascent Oriental philosophy. Let's return for a moment to Hassler's observation on how the École des Langues Orientales and the Collège de France complemented each other. Anglais' outrageous attack on the Collège de France were short-lived, and in the inaugural speech he gave in the fall of 1796 at the first opening of our school of the École des Langues Orientales, Langlais himself highlighted the bonds of proximity and complementarity and, in his words, mutual assistance. As I have already mentioned, the students moved between these two schools, the Collège de France and our schools, but so did the instructors in both directions. Sometimes they even combined jobs. In talking about institution, we also need to mention the Académie des Inscriptions et Belles-Lettres, which had close ties to the École des Langues Orientales and to the Collège de France. At the École des Langues Orientales, new chairs were gradually added to the existing ones. Armenian in 1812, spoken Greek in 1819, during the period of Phil-Hellenism, just 2 years before the start of the War of Independence. Spoken Arabic in 1820, separated from literary Arabic, with Rufai Zakour, Napoleon's personal interpreter, who was known in France as Raphaël de Monachy, and Hindustani in 1830. We need to give special mention to the major figure of the time, Antoine Isaac Sylvestre de Sacy, who we only mentioned in passing so far. A statue of him stands in the courtyard of Inalco's Maison de la Recherche at 2 Rue de Lille, where he undoubtedly never set foot. It's not sure, but this is first of all because, as an Arabic teacher, he was one of the first instructors at the school in 1796, despite his hostility to the major reforms of the French revolutions. For instance, he refused to declare his hatred for the monarchy. The statue is also there because he was the school's second director after Langlais from 1824 until his death, while he also ran to the Collège de France, where he had become a Persian instructor. Sylvestre de Sacy was an accomplished philologist, an outstanding teacher who wrote an Arabic reader, an Arabic grammar, which were to be used to the student of the École spéciale des langues orientales and were an historical milestone. His father was a lawyer and follower of Jansenism. That is quite important. And he was also a shrewd politician who has made a baron by Napoleon and then confirmed by Louis XVIII. He became a French peer, a grand officer of the Legion of Honor, an inspector of Oriental types from the Imprimerie Nationale, a permanent secretary of the Académie des Inscriptions, and a member of nearly all the European academies. He co-founded the Société Asiatique, the French one, in 1822 with the sinologist Abel Rémusat and the Indianist Burnouf, and in many regards was a pioneer of the Orientalist field. The decree of year 3 had set up the school inside the National Library, near the Oriental manuscripts, even closer than Langles, who was also a curator of Oriental manuscripts, had wanted for free access. But since the National Library didn't have a room that could be allocated to the new school, the school was put in a sort of elevated storage building in a small courtyard. Hassler described it as a stable fitted with miserable glass windows. The school would have to wait until 1834 to leave this uncomfortable, freezing site. Finally, 40 years after it was founded, the new school was given one room in the library to hold classes. Despite his initial successes under the Directory, the Empire, the Restoration, and July monarchy, the young school that was instituted by the Revolution, by the Convention, went through a crisis, a deep crisis, when Sylvestre de Sacy died in 1838. His personality was so overpowering that when he died, the school was like an orphan. The crisis was accentuated by the finicky, inapplicable royal order adopted the same year that sought to place the École Spéciale within the new university frameworks, which were unsuitable. The school, which was under the Ministry of the Interior when it was created, was placed under the authority of the Ministry of Public Education in 1832. The new it was the July monarchy. The new regulation, which was too formal to be applicable, was in fact never enforced, but the unstable situation put the school at risk. Also, this period was dark. New chairs were created. In particular, a Chinese chair, which in 1841 was given to Antoine Bazin, a disciple of Abel Rémusat, and a Malay and Japanese chair, which was occupied in 1842 by the versatile Édouard Dulaurier. During these early years, the school was somewhat removed from its original mission. It trained scholars more than interpreters. This likely explains, at least partly, why the École des Jeunes de Langue had something of a comeback in the first half of the 19th century, under the auspices of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which still considered it useful for training the interpreters who were needed for diplomacy. With its existence threatened after the death of Sylvestre de Sacy, the school seemed to fall into disfavor in the middle of the 19th century. One thing we can say for sure is that the entry that appeared in volume 7 of Pierre Larousse's great universal dictionary of the 19th centuries in 1870 was hardly flattering. It reads, "The École des langues orientales vivantes has not produced all the good results that one may have expected. Attendance in classes has generally been low. This undoubtedly because the courses of study do not lead to anything, no practical goal or specific profession. The classes are open to the public. Anyone can attend with no goal other than to learn. There is no final examination. It has been common for a professor to teach a class to a single student. Sometimes a professor will walk into a completely empty room and then leave. Yet the Larousse does say, however, the École des langues orientales has brought some glory to France, and several of the most prominent foreign Orientalists have studied there and benefited from its instruction. Fortunately, the school gained a sort of second founder in the person of Charles Schaeffer, an alumnus of the École des Jeunes de Langue and a Persian instructor. He became president in 1867 and helped give the school a new dimension. This year, thanks to the Universal Exposition, the school had received a large gift of Oriental works and documents. There wasn't enough room for them in the National Library, and Schaeffer set out to find an appropriate site. In late 1868, the school set up shop in a few rooms of the apartment of the director of the Collège de France, the sinologist Stanislas Julien, which have been left vacant. This solution was only temporary, and the school only stayed there until 1873, when it was given a beautiful 18th century private mansion, the Hôtel de Bernage, located at 2 Rue de Lille in the 17th arrondissement. During this transition period, a Japanese chair was created for Léon de Rosny in 1868, the same year of the Meiji Restoration. A Vietnamese chair was created in 1871 for Abel Desmichel. Vietnam had been front-page news since the Treaty of Saigon in 1862, and France sent military expeditions there. Built in 1716 by the Marquis de Baqueville on the left bank, which Queen Margot frequently visited in her time, the Rue de Lille building was purchased in 1767 by Jean-Louis Bernage, who had it restored. It had different owners, and at one point it housed Muhib Effendi, the ambassador from the Sublime Porte, the Ottoman Gate, to Napoleon I, before it became government property in 1831, the bâtiment of the Rue de Lille. It also had, at different times, the Paris Land Administration, the Ministry of Religions. In 1858, the building was placed under the oversight of the Department of the Navy, which gave it to the School of Naval Engineering. The school was later moved to Cherbourg in Normandy and left the site on October 16, 1872. Charles Schaeffer took advantage of this opportunity to convince the authorities to put the school there. The building was empty, but it was in very bad shape, and a lot of work was done in the 1880s. The buildings on the street side were rebuilt under the directions of Louis IV Dujaric, a government architect. The wing at the rear of the courtyard, which had collapsed, was also rebuilt. A large grand staircase with a magnificent balustrade was installed. The floors, wall, and ceilings were decorated elaborately. In 1933, together with the Asiatic Society of Paris, the school bought the building at number 4 and moved its library there. The library had grown a lot since the move to Rue de Lille, and Auguste Carrière was appointed the first secretary librarian in December 1873. In 1966, the west wing of the former Hôtel de Bernage, which adjoined number 4, was completely rebuilt under the guidance of architect Paul Barrias. The facades on the street side and the two buildings were made to match. Charles Schaeffer also worked on improving the regulation, which had been entirely unsuitable since 1838. The decree of November 1869, which renamed the institution the École impériale des langues orientales vivantes, or Imperial School of Living Oriental Languages, this is now during the Second Empire, intended, and I quote, to reorganize the school to return it to its original purpose. A balance was found between the practical objective of study and the academic rigor of the instruction. Article 2 specified that the purpose of the courses, which were open to the public and free, and lasted 3 years, was to teach students to read, write, and speak 10 languages. Spoken Arabic, the teaching of literary Arabic had been suspended. Persian, Turkish, Malay and Javanese, Armenian, modern Greek, Hindustani, spoken Chinese, Japanese, Vietnamese, and to teach them the political and commercial geography of the countries where these languages are used. Also, the decree gave little autonomy to an institution that was managed by the ministry. The school had enough flexibility to not require any particular academic qualification for instructors, so it could hire both professionals and academics. However, they were paid less than their counterparts at universities. Finally, when it moved to Rue de Lille in 1873, the new school, the new imperial school, absorbed the École des Jeunes de Langue and its own library. People sometimes say that Inalco originated from the École des Jeunes de Langue. This isn't accurate, but we do need to acknowledge the contribution of the École des Jeunes de Langue, which shared some common goals with Inalco. While the École des Jeunes de Langue served as a foil to Inalco when it was created in 1795, it also provided Inalco with students, teachers, such as Venture de Paradis, and directors, including Charles Schaeffer, and books. Under the Third Republic, after the defeat against Prussia, French higher education went through a major reform. The University of Paris was recreated in 1896. The Sorbonne, which became the seat of the University of Paris, was rebuilt starting in 1885. The École pratique des hautes études, was created on a German pattern, was created in 1868. In June 1914, the École des Langues Orientales adopted a new statute under the fruitful presidency of the Russian specialist Paul Boyer. This statute affirmed the previous focuses by turning the renamed École nationale des langues orientales vivantes, in French ENLOV, is quite a strange name, into a grand établissement. Like the Collège de France, the Museum of Natural History, and the École des Chartres. This strange French category, Grandes Écoles, Grand Établissement, defining France's most prestigious research and higher education institutions. In other words, the École nationale des langues orientales vivantes was a grande école in the French sense of the term. And for the first time in history, our school became a national one. The school's scope expanded considerably because this 1914 status gave it a mission to teach students to read, write, and speak the living languages of Eastern Europe, Asia, Oceania, and Africa, and to teach them about the geography, history, and institutions of the countries where these languages are used. Since the school had found a suitable location site, institutional stability, and first-rate directors, its identity was settled. In the early 20th century, it got a nickname Langzhou, and the students of Oriental languages, the Sylvains, nicknamed as a tribute to Sylvestre de Sacy, became infamous in the Latin Quarter for the quality of their pranks. In French, canular. A 1916 painting by Tullio Garbari, The Intellectuals as the Café Rotonde, with the Sartre and Beauvoir maybe in your mind, shows in the foreground Guillaume Apollinaire and the futurist Filippo Marinetti, and in the background Léon Blum, André Suarez, and none other than Paul Boyer, the Russian professor and director of the Langzhou nearby. But most important, and despite little administrative support, the school grew remarkably. The school now teaches several Slavic and Central European and Nordic languages. Russian since 1874, Romanian since 1875, Hungarian, Bulgarian, Serbo-Croatian, Czech, Polish, Albanian, Finnish, the Baltic languages, Ukrainian. New Asian languages, Mongolian in 1874 with Louis Rochet, who also made the sculpture of Sylvestre de Sacy in Rue de Lise. He was sculptor and professor of Mongolian. Thai in 1888, Khmer and Bengali, several African languages. Malagasy since 1895, the year Madagascar was annexed. Jean Paulhan, the famous writer, was made lecturer in 1910. Amharic since 1898, Sudanese languages, Berber since 1913, Morocco had become a protectorate in 1912, and Hebrew and Yiddish beginning in 1937. In 1914, around 30 languages were being taught, some of them as freestanding classes that did not always become a permanent part of the program. And this number continued to rise between the First and Second World Wars. We already saw that Eastern Europe has entered the scope of Oriental knowledge, thanks in particular to the energetic efforts of Paul Boyer. But we also need to mention the opening to Africa and other parts of Asia, which was obviously related to France's colonial expansion. Remember that the Berlin Conference of 1884, organized by Otto von Bismarck, regulated European colonizations and trade in Africa, and that the expedition of Captain Jean-Baptiste Marchand reached Fashoda on July 10, 1898. A little-known chapter in the history of the Langzhou is his institutional partnership with the École Coloniale, the colonial school, which was founded in 1889, with the purpose of training the colonial administrators. This school was housed in a beautiful structure built in 1895 near the Luxembourg Gardens. It offered courses in the overseas languages, ethnology, customary law, and public and private colonial law. In some cases, instructors taught at both institutions, in the colonial school and in our school, and students also moved between them. More broadly, the role of our school in France's colonial policies is worth examining more closely. As far as I know, no one has ever looked into it. I'd like to add 3 points about these years when the school was going through major growth during the Second Empire and the Third Republic, under the productive iron reign of Charles Schaeffer and Paul Boyer, who should also get more credit. First, in an effort to offer superior practical language courses, the school began to hire native speakers more consistently. The position of tutor, in French répétiteur, appeared in the organization chart of the school in 1869, but several years earlier, Léon de Rosny had already assigned the Japanese conversation class to a native speaker paid from his personal funds. He don't speak Japanese. These students overwhelmingly supported these instructors who they could practice the languages they were studying with. This led to a hierarchy between the professors, who were most often French or European, and often taught theory or culture courses, and these native tutors who were kept in a subordinate position. Also, their contribution to the history of Oriental studies is important, it has often been overlooked. Second, After the rediscovery of Angkor Wat by Henri Moore in 1861, France became infatuated with Cambodian culture. A permanent archaeological mission was created in Indochina by Paul Doumer in 1898. It became the École Française d'Extrême-Orient, or French School of Far East, in January 1900, and what was placed under the academic oversight of the Académie des Inscriptions et Belles-Lettres. Its research centered on archaeology and gradually expanded to history, languages, and ethnology of Asia as a whole. There's also the Musée Guimet, which opened in Lyon in 1879 and then moved to Paris, and the Musée Tcharsky, which opened in 1898 thanks to the bequest of the banker of the name to the city of Paris. These are just a few examples showing how institutions that was focused of Asia multiplied in the late 19th centuries. The history of their relationships deserves more recognition. The last things to mention is that in December 1906, a number of prominent people who had noticed the fragility of Oriental studies in the United Kingdom shared their concerns with the British Prime Minister, who then set up a committee which Paul Boyer participated in, and which in 1909 submitted a report stating the need to establish in London a school for Oriental languages, which was sorely lacking. The School of Oriental Studies received its royal charter on June 5, 1916, and moved into 2 Finsbury Circus. The A for Africa wasn't added to the name of the school until 1938, when the campus of the SOAS moved to its current location on Thornhoe Street. Longley's initial idea was continuing, transcending national borders. World War II did not spare the school. Some instructors and students were called up to fight, driven out, deported, or killed. However, classes continued. For example, the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, who moved to 5 Rue de Lille in 1941, regularly crossed the street during the war for 3 years to study Chinese with Paul de Mieville. I'm not sure, but it seems that the post-war years were not very active in the school. After the war, Hebrew, Yiddish, and Ladino courses resumed. Some new languages were added, especially in the early 60s. Swahili, Hula, Hausa, and Mandinka, Georgian, Urdu, Kurdish, Pashto, and Romani, Burmese, Nepali, Lao, Tagalog, and Korean, Slovenian and Macedonian, and some languages of Oceania. In 1969, there were around 50 languages being taught. But still, this was maybe a slightly sleepy institution that was hit with full force by the democratization of access to universities that occurred in the 60s, and especially the events of May 1968. The number of students in Russian started surging in the late 40s. The Japanese program exploded in the 60s and 70s, and there was a xenophilic wave in the early 70s. The school needed to be able to hold all the new students and adjust to these new audiences and the changing world. It needed to step out of its Orientalist ghetto without forsaking its conviction, and assimilate better into the higher education system without being diluted in the process. After the events of May, in 1969, the Minister of National Education, Edgar Faure, a former Russian student, created the short-lived Centre Universitaire des Langues Orientales Vivantes, the CULOV, or University Center of Living Oriental Languages. In 1970, a decision was made to attach a school to the University of Paris III under the name INLCO, an acronym for Institut National des langues et civilisations orientales, or National Institute for Oriental Languages and Culture, which soon turned into Inalco. Thanks to this decision, the school could start issuing national degrees. The only thing left to do was to find a good site. The Japanese scholar René Siffer, who later translated the Genji Monogatari and became president in 1971, sent the institution on a necessary but grueling and endless quest. Little by little, temporary sites were found. For the Asian languages, Porte Dauphine in the 16th arrondissement, in the buildings left vacant by NATO in 1966, when France left the integrated commandant of NATO at the instigation of General de Gaulle. The Arabic languages set up in Asnières, Russian, Hebrew, and the European languages in Clichy, the African languages in Riquet in the 19th arrondissement, and research on Rue Broca in the 13th arrondissement, while the administrative offices and library remain on Rue de Lille in the 7th arrondissement, far from the students, who struggled to find room in classrooms that were often too cramped. The buildings were not always sparkling. Unfortunately, several plans to get all the language under one roof were aborted. One in Marne-la-Vallée, another one in Cergy-Pontoise, that was a far suburb, another one in Boulevard Jourdan in the 14th arrondissement, to name just a few. The temporary situation was becoming permanent, and this was discouraging. However, during these difficult years, the institution continued to reform. It changed its internal structures. For example, for the first time in its history, languages and areas, which until then had been isolated, were grouped into departments with historical and geographical borders. The first effort led to the creation in 1972 of a structure that would make language study more practical, the CPEI, which stood for Centre de Préparation aux Échanges Internationaux, which focused on international business. Inalco found a stable status with the decree of 1984, which under the Savary law during the presidency of Mitterrand, who was elected in 1981, gave it back its independence, which was somewhat lost between 1970 and 1984. Here are some excerpts from the text that still governs us today. The Institut National des Langues et Civilisations Orientales, which is based in Paris, is a public, academic, cultural, and professional institution. It is a grand établissement within the meaning of article of the French Education Code. The duties of our institute are: 1, to provide beginning and continuing courses related to the study of the languages and cultures of Asia, Africa, Eastern Europe, Oceania, and the Amerindian populations, and on the geography, history, institutions, and political, economics, and social life of the countries in question. 2, to develop research in these different fields, particularly alongside other French or foreign research institutions. 3, to contribute by sharing its academic and educational output to knowledge about the countries in question. And 4, to promote university and cultural exchanges and cooperation between France and the countries in question. Within this new one-of-kind framework, and while still being incorporated into a comprehensive university law, Inalco could prepare students for all the national degrees, from the BA to the MA, doctorate, and additional doctorate granting accreditation to supervised research. The status of the tenured faculty was completely aligned with that for ordinary universities. Tenured full professor and associate professor in terms of hiring and career trajectory. But the numbers of instructors whose status was insecure still kept growing. The selection of languages continued to get more diverse with the addition of Lingala, Yoruba, and Wolof, Quechua, and Inuktitut, Indonesian, Telugu, and Sinhala. Culture courses were also added. By 2010, Inalco was teaching 100 languages. The selection of professional programs also continued to grow, with the addition of a natural language processing program in 1985, another in higher international studies in 1986, and yet another in multilingual engineering, also in 1986. The school joined the so-called Bologna process and the LMD system, or Bachelor Master Doctorate system, without any major conflict. Research also continued to ramp up and gain more structure over the last 3 or 4 decades. More centers and units have sprung up and are suited to a particularly mobile academic environment. In 2010, Inalco was a founding member of the Sorbonne Paris Cité Alliance. Since the 1970s, Inalco continued to look for a place where it could bring everyone together under one roof. It refused to give up. Following the report of Maurice Garden as part of the U3M plan from 2000, the plan for the so-called Pôle des langues et civilisations, or campus of languages and cultural studies, was launched. It was to be located at 65 Rue des Grands Moulins, here in the 13th arrondissement, near the new National Library and the current Grands Moulins campus of the University of Paris. Paris Cité now. It was meant to group together Inalco and a new library, the so-called BULAC, or University Library of Languages and Cultures, the successor of the former Inter-University Library of Oriental Languages, which had been separated from the school since 1971. The architecture's firm Atelier Lyon Associés won the competition in 2004. Work started in 2008, and all the courses have been taught together in the new buildings since October 2011, here. After 40 years of wandering, we were finally together. Today, more than 100 languages are taught, and the stage is set for us to achieve new ambitions, such as the creation of cross-disciplinary, thematic, and disciplinary courses, which started in 2019, and give teams of instructors of varied languages, areas, and disciplines a chance to work together on educational projects addressing things like religious issues, environmental or health problems, connected history, anthropology, or linguistics. At the same time, Inalco, with help from the Inalco Foundation, recently established, decided to renovate the building at Rue de Lille, the former Hôtel de Bernage, its historical site since 1873, to give it back its shine and provide a place for conferences and suitable workspaces for the research departments and researchers. The new Maison de la Recherche was inaugurated in October 2021. It still features its famous weather vane, a crane, serpent, and crescent that sits under the slightly dumbfounded but definitively benevolent gaze of Antoine Isaac Sylvestre de Sacy. In French, we say Petit poisson deviendra grand pourvu que Dieu lui prête vie. That's La Fontaine. The little fish will larger grow, provided God still give him life. What a journey it has been. To conclude this brief overview, I'd like to cite this verse by Jean de La Fontaine from The Little Fish and the Fisherman. Another time in French. Petit poisson deviendra grand pourvu que Dieu lui prête vie. La Fontaine, this quintessential French poet, was in fact deeply inspired by Oriental literature. He sometimes drew on the Panchatantra that was written in Sanskrit, possibly before the year 0, and arrived in Europe through a series of translations into Persian and Arabic, Kalila wa Dimna, Greek and Hebrew, Castilian, Spanish and Latin, and finally into French from the Persian by Gilbert Gomin in 1644. The so-called Book of Lights, composed by the sage Pilpai Indian from Gomin, fascinated La Fontaine, and in it he found the morals of many fables, such as animals sick of the plague, the milkmaid of the pot of milk, tortoise and the two ducks, and the cat, the weasel, and the Hugh rabbit, to name just a few well-known examples. The little fish will grow. I think about our colleagues and the students who work in the National Library during the Restoration in that low-ceilinged dark space that could not look more miserable than the Paris work manager with the illegible signatures described in 1823. I think about the feeling of abandonment we sometimes had in the corridors of Centre Dauphine, where I studied Japanese a few years ago, where we wasn't welcome. This was less than 30 years ago, at the end of the 20th century. The École Spéciale des Langues Orientales has changed a lot since 1795, but I think the deep intuition that motivated L'Anglaise and La Canal, the intuition about the importance of studying Oriental languages, is more relevant than ever, in many respects, for the honor of the human spirit, as well for concrete, burning imperatives. In this talk, I often come back to the cross-border aspect of the history of our institution. It is indisputable, and I'm delighted that we've all come together here today with you. We have a lot to do together, but one task, among others, which may provide perspective for our shared ambitions, would be to connect the histories of our institutions. According to a very brief survey I did, 3 comparable institutions were created in Europe before the Paris École des Langues Orientales. 2 in Italy. First, the Scuola di Giovanni di Lingua in Venice in 1551. Then the Collegio dei Cinesi in Napoli in 1732. And one in the Habsburg Empire by Empress Maria Theresa, the Akademie für Orientalische Sprachen in Vienna in 1744. Then, in the 19th century, there was the Lazarev Institute in Moscow, which was founded in 1815 on a private initiative. Outside Europe, there was the Institute for the Study of Western Documents, the Bansho Shirabesho, which was founded by the shogunate in Edo in 1857 and became now what is so-called the Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. Then, during World War I, the School of Oriental Studies in London, which I've already mentioned. Finally, the Moscow Institute of Oriental Studies, Moskovsky Institut Vostokoviedienia. There are surely others, and I apologize for any omissions. And of course, we need to mention the degree programs in Oriental languages created within general universities or institutions. We will benefit for learning each other's history, so we can, as Paul Vane said, take stock of our differences. Thank you very much for your listening.